But today we're very grateful to be able to welcome back to the FCC Tony Wheeler, who spoke here last when he was running The Lonely Planet, and now he's but a consultant to The Lonely Planet. Hands up people who have not used a Lonely Planet book. Okay. So I think we all know what this is about, so let us welcome Tony in the usual manner.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I see I'm supposed to talk about, can shoestring travel be sustainable today? And that's rather nice because I'm really not sure what that means. I wasn't sure whether it means, if you are traveling as a shoestring traveler, is your travel a sustainable thing? Or does it mean, is the concept of shoestring travel something that can carry on? So I've got two topics to talk about, which makes it much easier to occupy however many minutes I'm allowed up here. And I guess really we need to start by defining what shoestring travel is. And I look back to the first trips that sort of kicked Lonely Planet off, which started in 1972. I was living in London at the time, and Maureen, my wife, we hadn't been married for a year. We'd been married about 6 months. And we bought an old car, and we set out from London to drive this car as far as it would get us. And we paid £60 for it. And British cars worked better in that era. They work better again now, but there was certainly a period when they didn't. You drove them out of the car dealership and they'd broken down before you got to the end of the street. But we brought this £60 car, we drove it all the way across Europe, and we got to the Bosphorus at a time when there were no bridges or tunnels from one side of Istanbul to the other. So you had to get on a ferry and had this real feeling of going from one continent to another as you crossed from European Istanbul to Asian Istanbul. And this car it cost us so little, our feeling was we could just park it by the roadside and walk away from it if it broke down. But it carried on all the way across Turkey and all the way across Iran and into Afghanistan, and we eventually drove it as far as Kabul in Afghanistan and sold it for a £5 profit. I've subsequently said it was probably Osama bin Laden's getaway vehicle. And if they just, checked the satellite photographs and seen this old Mini parked outside a house in Abbottabad, they would have saved themselves an awful lot of CIA investigations and times tracking Mr. bin Laden down. Well, we sold the car there and we carried on through Pakistan and India and up to Kathmandu and across to Bangkok, and we were by this time running so low on money that we hitchhiked from Bangkok all the way down to Singapore. And this was the era when Lee Kuan Yew was in power and convinced that men with long hair were going to undermine the hard-working youth of Singapore. Of course, I had a lot more long hair in those days, and I can't find the old passport anymore. But Maureen says at the Malaysian border they stamped in our passports SHIT for suspected hippie in transit. We were in transit. We got down to Singapore and we took a boat across to Jakarta and travelled down through Java and to Bali. And in Bali we met some New Zealanders with a yacht who wanted to sail down to Australia, and we chipped in $20 for fuel and got a sort of free ride down to Australia. And eventually, having arrived on Exmouth and the Northwest Cape and hitchhiked down to Perth and then across to Sydney, arrived in Sydney with 27 cents left between us. They still had 1 cent coins in Australia at that time. And that was all we had. But then that was the start of Lonely Planet, because we wrote a book about that first trip. We hadn't intended to write a book. It was only after we got there and realized how many people were interested in what we'd done and where we'd been, that we decided there was a market for this and wrote what turned out to be the first Lonely Planet guidebook. And to our utter amazement, it was much more of a success than we thought it might have been. We both had full-time jobs at that time. And that prompted us to think, well, let's do another book. And we set off to write Southeast Asia on a shoestring. We spent all of 1974 traveling around Southeast Asia. And our plan had been we would write the best guidebook anybody had ever seen to Southeast Asia, which was not a difficult thing to do because nobody had ever seen a guidebook to Southeast Asia. It just hadn't, Vietnam was, for Americans, it was all of Southeast Asia was defined as a war zone because of Vietnam. Bangkok was virtually tourism there was really just R&R for soldiers from Vietnam. Singapore was still a mildly exotic place rather than the big air-conditioned shopping centre. Indonesia, well, Suharto hadn't been in power long, and Sukarno, his idea of welcoming tourism to Indonesia was burning down the British embassy. So tourism wasn't a hot topic in Southeast Asia at that time. It's amazing to look how much it's changed. But that was we spent all of 74 traveling around and wrote our Southeast Asia guide. Now, both of these books, Across Asia and Southeast Asia on a Shoestring, were definitely shoestring travel guides. And I have to think now, what was shoestring travel? And it was books for shoestring travelers. It definitely wasn't books for shoestring tourists. And that, of course, gets you into the traveler versus tourism thing, which I think is a complete furphy, really, that if you're traveling, you're a tourist. People have said, one of the nice little definitions is tourists don't know where they've been and travelers don't know where they're going, which I think is rather nice in a way. And I've always liked that idea of travel, that you wake up in the morning and think, well, where am I going to end up tonight? I didn't like the place I got to yesterday, so I will move on. I won't hang around. Or maybe I did like it and I will hang around. Whereas if you're a tourist and you're on the tour bus, it leaves at 9:30 and you have to leave with it. So there was a certain amount of travel tourism thing in being a shoestring traveler. And then there was also a certain amount of doing it on a budget that went with it. And perhaps the two were connected. And I guess there was a little bit of ageism in it. When we started Lonely Planet, I was in my early 20s. So I was doing books for people who also were traveling like shoestring travelers, didn't have much money, and were young. But of course, all those things have changed. You don't have to be, I think, you don't have to be young to be a philosophical shoestring traveler. The idea of not knowing where you're going and what you want to do and traveling closer to ground level, perhaps. I remember somebody writing to us once saying that they liked that sort of travel, but they didn't want the discomforts, and they still like staying in Hiltons, and they defined themselves as Hilton hippies, which I thought was a nice little line. I look back at how travel has changed over those years, and I put it down to a number of things, and a number of things that have been the big factors in change. And one of them, of course, has been this whole internet and communications and so on. Of course, when we were doing that travel in the 70s, you couldn't just go online and find if there was a hotel room available and find what time the flights left and find which airline was cheapest. If you wanted an airline ticket, you had to go around to the airline office to buy it. So those sort of things have made it a lot easier. We didn't have the communication. If you wanted to make a phone call in the 70s, there were phone offices where you went in and you booked the call one day, and they told you to come back in 24 hours' time. And when you came back in 24 hours' time, they'd say, no, wait another hour and a half, and then you couldn't get through anyway. Or you did get through, but the line was so bad you couldn't understand who you were talking to. Whereas now the damn phone rings in your pocket and it's somebody calling you up, and the last thing you want is the communication. Today, email, the letters come in at any point. If you drop into the FCC, you can find what their Wi-Fi code is, and your daughter's just written you about something, which happened to me downstairs just now. Whereas in the old days, you had to go to the Poste Restante and queue up and get your letters, which were generally misfiled under your Christian name rather than your surname. So you had to then ask for another lot to look through, and half the time they disappeared anyway. All those communication things, and credit cards. We didn't have credit cards back then. If you wanted to pay for things, you either had cash or traveler's checks, and when you ran out, you had run out. You couldn't get a credit card advance and so on. So all those sort of communication and connection things have disappeared dramatically, have changed dramatically in the years since we did those first shoestring travel trips. But of course, the other thing that's changed so much has been aircraft. The fact that there are now these big aircraft, and instead of being with 40 or 50 people, you're with 300 or 400, or the next generation of A380s will be able to carry 1,000 people if they put them all in an economy. And of course, low-cost carriers, which started in America, spread to Europe, is now all over Asia as well. So not only of the means of communicating when you're traveling, but the actual travel itself has become much easier. And very often when people ask, what's the big change, and they expect you to say either the internet or the 747 or the low-cost carrier. But the other thing that's really changed, and here we are sitting right beside it, is the areas of the world that have opened up. Back in the 70s, of course, I remember the first time I came to Hong Kong, one of the things you did in Hong Kong was go up to the border of the new territory so you could look over the border and say, oh, look, I can see Chinese people. It was one of the things of coming to Hong Kong, going up there and looking over to China. You could look and you could actually see China on a clear day. Of course, now you can't, even on a clear day, you can't see it, can you? But that was part of it. And China, this very, very large chunk of the world, was completely inaccessible. Unless you were a president of somewhere or had some very special invitation, you just did not go to China. So the fact that that whole large slice of the world has opened up, and it isn't the only slice of the world, there's lots of other places which are much more accessible today. Of course, there are places that have closed down. The doors, Syria, wonderful country to travel around, and that's really off the travel list at the moment. But overall, there are far more places open now than there were back in the 70s. So I think travel in the shoestring travel era has changed in all sorts of ways. That it's not just the connections and communications, it's also the means of transport, and also it's the places we can go to. But at the end of the day, I think that the real thing which I think shoestring travel is important and why it will remain sustainable is the value of it. And I think that comes from a number of different factors. One comes from the fact that when you're traveling on a shoestring, or traveling not just on necessarily a shoestring budget, but traveling with that shoestring philosophy of not knowing where you're going, traveling closer to ground level, that you do travel more slowly, you are more engaged, you are making more of a connection with the people that you travel amongst. I think that's really important. I think that that communication of travel is really one of the most important things. I think it's one of the most important things of travel, no matter how you travel. It's remarkable how when you go places, you find that they're not the same as they were when you saw them on the television or read in a book or saw some movie or heard something about it. Actually being there at ground level is an entirely different experience. And I've had this come through to me most recently, just 6 or 8 weeks ago, when I managed to arrive in Pakistan just as the whole blasphemous American movie thing kicked off. And I crossed the border from India and went to Islamabad, and I fortunately managed to leave Islamabad 2 days before the riots started there. But then for the next 2 weeks, everywhere that we went through Pakistan, we'd come into some smaller town and go to the hotel, and we'd step into the door in the hotel, and everybody in the hotel is huddled around the television set, and the television's showing angry mobs and mullahs saying, that Islam is the right thing and Christianity isn't, and people holding up signs saying death to America, and even behead Obama was one I saw. And then all the people crowding around television would turn around and see us turning up and say, oh, welcome, come in, have a cup of tea, sit down, glad to see you. And this is not the picture we would have got if we'd sort of just read the newspaper before we went and thought, oh, maybe we shouldn't be going to Pakistan right now. And I think that communication is one of the most important things. And the other thing which I'll just finish up with on this is that tourism is one of the biggest tourism and travel is they say it's the biggest industry in the world, that more money gets spent on tourism and travel than anything else. We even spend more on it than buying cars, despite all the cars being churned out in the world these days. But one of the things about shoestring travel is that you put that money in at ground level. And very often the money is staying there at ground level. It's not money that goes back to the International Hotel Management Corporation in London or New York or Geneva or wherever else they are. So I think that shoestring travel, it will sustain, that we are doing the right thing when we travel. That there's a lot of talk today that travel is a occupation that damages the environment and does the wrong thing by the environment. And in that case, I am guilty because I do travel a lot. But there are compensating things as well, and I think those compensating things more than make up for the damage that travel causes. That when we go out there and travel, we are putting money back into places and putting money back into places at the right level. And lots of places in the world, any place in the world really, tourism and travel has some value. But there are some places in the world where it's the major part of the economy. It isn't just a small part, it's the major part. And in those places, if we weren't going there, their economies would be in much worse shape. So for me, shoestring travel, it's sustainable. Thank you very much. And we do have time to take questions.
Yeah, come and sit down and answer questions.
Well, I'm happy standing here.
Okay, well.
And what I should say first, when I was here last time, I was here just after I'd been to North Korea. And I went to North Korea as part of as soon as George Bush said there's an axis of evil, my very first thought was, well, I want to go there. I want to see that. I mean, he made me this travel list. So I went to North Korea. I went to North Korea, which I hadn't been to before. Definitely the weirdest country I've ever been to. And the subsequent years after that, it hasn't changed. It was still the weirdest country I've ever been to. I went to Iran. I went back to Iran. I'd been there before. I went to Iraq right in the middle of the war going on, which made it interesting. And then I went to a bunch of other places that for various reasons have been labeled as bad. Burma, which was until very recently was bad and suddenly is looked upon as being much better than it used to be. Cuba, which if Mitt Romney was the president today, it would be the 13th president that Fidel Castro had to deal with. Instead, he's still dealing with the 12th president, and they've all said that he's a bad man and should leave. There should be some regime change there. I went to Saudi Arabia, went to Afghanistan, went to Albania, went to Libya. And they were all interesting bad countries. In fact, I had so much fun visiting those places, and they were all much easier to travel around than I'd thought, and people were very nice to me in all of them. But I thought really I should write a follow-up book, and there's no shortage of bad places around the world. But the follow-up, which will be out next year, I think it might be called Travels in Fairy Tale Lands, because I decided each of these countries had a fairy tale attached to it. If Iraq had been in this new book, it would have been Pandora's box. Do not open this box, do not look inside. It will only bring you trouble if you open it up. And of course, that has been exactly the situation with Iraq. But there are other countries that are Cinderella countries or Ant and the Grasshopper countries. There's a fairy tale attached to each of them. And in the last couple of years, I've been traveling to, if I can remember them all, Haiti, the Congo, Colombia, Zimbabwe, a number of them. I've had 8 of them that I've been to in the last year or so. And they've all been very interesting. Pakistan, that's why I went there, Papua New Guinea, Israel and Palestine. And the one that I'm still thinking of adding to that list is Somaliland, the sort of northern half of Somalia that's not so difficult and not quite so dangerous to travel to. But Somaliland, nobody recognizes Somaliland. And they've only got 3 sort of diplomatic offices in the world. One is in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa. One is in Washington, D.C. And one is in London. So last week I thought, well, I'll just drop into the Somaliland diplomatic, can't call it an embassy because it isn't a country, diplomatic office and just get a visa, just in case I do get the opportunity to go to Somaliland in the next few months. So I went in there and filled out the form, and they were about to give me my visa. And the guy said, this is valid for 3 months. And I said, oh dear, I'm not sure if I'm going to get there in the next 3 months. It only gives me November, December, January. And I thought I might not get there till February or March. And he said, well, okay, don't get a single entry visa, get a multiple entry visa, and that lasts for 6 months. And I said, okay, that sounds okay. He said, tell you what, I'll make it a year. I like countries like that. We need more of them. So anyway, any questions?
Yeah. Hands up. And, well, okay, in lieu of the first question, I will ask you, where haven't you been?
Where haven't I been? You know, there's a long list of places I haven't been, and I'll start with the Yemen. I've never been to the Yemen, and it's got that amazing mud architecture, these medieval skyscrapers that look fantastic in photographs, and it's got the most perfect form of Arabic, I'm told, and even I don't speak any Arabic at all, apart from Salam Alaikum and a few other things. But so Yemen would be top of the list. Then next would be the stands. I've been to Kurdistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, but I've been to Kazakhstan. But the rest of the stands I haven't been to. I should just say something about Kazakhstan when I went there. I went there about 3 years ago to see something very touristy, to see a tourist go up to the International Space Station. And it was really one of the most interesting trips I've done, even though all I got to do was just watch him depart. And we went, and there were a group of us, about a dozen of us went to see this. And that dozen, one of them was Sergey Brin, another was Larry Page. So I spent several days with them going to see this. And we first of all went to Moscow to see the Cosmonaut Training Center. Because if you want to be a tourist and go up to the International Space Station, you have to do three things. First of all, you have to front up $20 million US. That's the price tag. That gets you the flight up, the flight back, and it gets you 2 weeks on the International Space Station, all meals included. But it doesn't get you any frequent flyer points at all, because there is one person who's done it twice, who's paid the 20 million once and liked it so much that 3 years later he came back and spent another 20 million and went up there for another visit. But you have to also spend 6 months at the Cosmonaut Training Center learning how to be a cosmonaut. So we had a day at the Cosmonaut Training Center to see what they went through in their 6 months. And you have to learn to speak Russian. So you have to be reasonably fluent in Russian before you hand the $20 million over first. So if you fail the Russian examinations, they keep the money. But anyway, we went down there, and we met the three guys going up: one cosmonaut, one NASA astronaut who NASA were paying the money to, and one computer game entrepreneur who was paying to go up there. And we watched the thing being fueled and everything else. And then the final really good moment in all this was when it went off, and there were a bunch of NASA people there, and the NASA people were saying, well, if this was Cape Canaveral, we would be in the concrete bunker 4 kilometers away. Well, Kazakhstan, we're standing out in the desert about 200 yards away from the desert. And when it went off, you could feel that the heat hit you, and it was just fantastic. It was a really exciting moment. I loved it. So I want to go to the rest of the stands, Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan.
Do you know there's a lot of stands? I've counted 14, and I think there's more.
Oh, really? Well, there you go. I hadn't counted that many. There's quite a few I haven't been to.
Well, some of them aren't countries.
Yeah, well, no, Kurdistan isn't. But yeah, there no shortage of stands. That'll keep me busy for a long time.
Well, to bring you back to Earth, just one question I've always wanted to ask. Have you stayed at the Chungking Mansions?
Have I? Well, we were talking about this earlier today, that when we did our first China guide in 1985, and we weren't first off the ranks. There were some other guides to independent travel in China not long before that, because it only really started to sort of kick off in the early 80s. And I know at Lonely Planet we started getting letters from people saying, hey, guess where I am? I'm in China. I just got a visa and I'm just traveling around China by myself. Because of course, travel to China had started prior to that, but it was strictly in sort of group things, and everyone commented how polite and wonderful everybody was, and how every meal had 14 courses to it, and travel very quickly changed from that initial encounter. But all the early visas the visas to travel independently all seemed to be issued in Chungking Mansions, and Chungking Mansions became the world's visa headquarters. Well, I'd stayed in Chungking Mansions from way earlier than that. I'd stayed there the first time, I think it was in 76 or 77. And of course, they've been going for far longer than that. And it's still a place that I really wouldn't feel I'd been to Hong Kong if I hadn't sort of stopped in there and at least, changed some money or had a Pakistani meal or got my laundry done or something. I don't stay there anymore. I'm staying at the Upper House. Very nice hotel. But I probably can just about see Chungking mansions across Hong Kong Harbour from there. My room was on the right side. But yeah, I stayed in Chungking mansions quite a few times over the years, the early years, and it was always very, very interesting. And I'm certainly glad I did it, and I'm certainly glad I haven't got to do it anymore.
Well, anyone from the floor here? Okay, at the back there. Wait for the microphone and identify yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Sian Powell. I was just wondering if you've ever found yourself in a very tricky situation, in a difficult place, whether you've been arrested by, say, Afghan cops or shot at by Iranian soldiers or anything like that.
And any really tricky situations. I generally, I'd say the most dangerous things that ever happened to me are usually in the back of taxis. And it can be in very civilized countries. I mean, taxis always seem to be the most scary places on earth when you get these drivers who can't seem to see beyond the end of their bonnet. But I did get arrested once last year, and that was, that doing this book on travels in fairy tale lands, there are certain things, if you went to these countries and they didn't happen to you, you'd feel, if you went to Ireland and at some point you didn't have one Guinness too many and stumble home, after hours with a horrible hangover, you wouldn't really feel you'd been to Ireland. If you'd been to, France and someone didn't say how terrible your French was and all you were saying was merci beaucoup, you'd be disappointed. You wouldn't really feel you'd been to France. Well, the two things that happened to me with this fairy tale book that I'm working on, one was you really wouldn't think you'd been to Palestine unless someone threw rocks at you, and someone threw rocks at me twice. Once I think they thought I was an Israeli and I was a bit too close to the wall, so they chucked a couple of rocks at me. And then when I sort of said, "What are you doing?" and showed them my passport, they apologized. And the other occasion was I did get sort of mildly arrested in Congo, because the Congolese, they are really against taking photographs. And I didn't have you're supposed to get a photograph permit, and I didn't have one. And I thought I was being quite surreptitious, but somebody jumped out and grabbed me, and then somebody else was yelling at me. And this was obviously an opportunity to extract money from you. And I said, let's go to the police station. And we went to the police station and we chatted for about an hour and they let me go. But I never got in this is back to taxis. The whole time I was in the Congo, I never once got in a taxi without the taxi at some point being stopped by the police to try and extract money from the taxi driver, of course. And there's more opportunity to do it if he's got a foreigner in the taxi as well. And the funniest moment was when we got stopped by a taxi in Goma, town near the Rwandan border. And we got pulled over and we spent about 20 minutes talking, and the taxi, he had so much paperwork. He had licenses and operating permits and insurance certificates and everything else, and this went on and on and on. And eventually he had to hand some money over and we drove off. And I said, well, in my terrible French, what was all that about? And he said, oh, he wanted my driving license and I didn't have it, so I paid the fine. And he said, actually, I do have it, and pulled it out. He said, but the trouble is, if you show the police your driving license, they can take it away from you, and that can be really expensive to get back. So you're much better saying you haven't got your driving license and paying the fine for not having your driving license than to admit you've got your driving license. And that sort of, for me, sort of summed up the Congo.
Okay. Next, over here in the front.
I'm George Russell. I'm from the Institute of Accounting magazine. You were talking about how information has changed so much that in those, back from post-Rustan, now you've got all this internet information. But as someone who's used things like TripAdvisor and even Thorntree sometimes, is there too much information? I mean, you can have this hotel that's got a 5-star review. It's the best place I've ever stayed. That's one horrible 1-star, same night, same hotel. Is there still a role for Lonely Planet in cutting through that interference and delivering a single product?
Yeah, I think there is. There is certainly far too much information these days, and you can, if you want to, you can spend forever. And I consistently, how much time do you want to spend saving another $5 on a rent-a-car? Now, I might look at 2 or 3, but I'm not going to go through every single rent-a-car thing to find what the cheapest one is. And similarly with, one of the things they say about reviews these days is they're all turning out to be either 1-star or 5-star. There's nothing in between at all. It's either the people hate the place or they're the business next door, And they're just trying to put the place out of business. So saying, oh, that hotel is terrible, it's only 1 star. Whereas this hotel is wonderful, possibly because I'm writing the review about my own hotel and saying it's 5 star. So yeah, you do have to decide how much information you want to plow through before you get to an answer. And you have to, these days, be very suspicious because, and if I was going to defend the guidebook over TripAdvisor, it is that we're sending somebody out there who is definitely not being bribed in any way. That we say at the very start to our writers that if we ever hear that you've been influenced in any way, that's it. Your career as a travel writer with us is finished. So you are
by
getting
alcohol. Influenced by alcohol would be a...
the only we despite which we have had all sorts of interesting incidents with it, and the funniest one was with our Vietnam guide quite some years ago, and actually the guy who wrote that also wrote our Hong Kong guide at one point, I think. Robert Story, straight as a die guy, and he lived in Taiwan for quite a while, and he'd gone off and written the new edition of the Vietnam guide. And then we started getting letters back from various hotels and restaurants and so on, saying, look, you really liked my place last time, and this time you don't even mention it, or you're not as nice as it said, and I've paid the money. Why am I not getting the good coverage? So we called up Robert and said, well, what's this we're hearing about you, taking money from places, and you haven't even done it very well because you've taken money from some places and then you haven't even mentioned them. And he couldn't believe this, and he investigated some more. And what had happened is he'd taken on a car and driver to get around Vietnam, and every place he'd gone to, his driver had been issuing his own invoices. And Robert had gone back to sit down and write up his notes, and meanwhile his driver was busily writing up coverage in Lonely Planet Guide, $100, please pay me. So we subsequently told our writers as well, be very careful about how trustworthy your driver is.
Okay, up the front here.
Hi, my name is Guy Fulton. Do you have a particular favourite country or city that you revisit or you never tire of going back to?
No, I don't. There's lots of places I've been back to many times, and probably the one I've spent more time going back to, I was just toting it up the other week, that within another year or two, I will have spent a year going back to Nepal, and it's because of the trekking. I've walked up to the Everest Base Camp. Well, there's 3 weeks of your life gone. I've walked around the Annapurna Circuit. There's another 3 weeks. And you do enough walks, and you soon tote up quite a lot of time in Nepal. I've had a lot of good trips to Burma, and part of that has been inspired by the fact that we had a lot of criticism about our Burma guide at one point. A lot of people said we shouldn't be publishing a guide to Burma. It only encourages the military to be as horrible as they are. And of course now that's all changed around. But we'd made a lot of friends in Burma in the interim. So Burma had a place. But I like the weird and wonderful travel, going to places like the Congo and be getting arrested, or Palestine and having stones thrown at you. But I also love, I'm just in Brussels the day before yesterday. And for some reason I'd never been to Brussels before, and I was just knocked out by what a beautiful city it is and how interesting it is to wander around and how good the restaurants are. I've lived in Paris for a year, and I had a wonderful time in Paris. And although my favorite Paris story when I was there, we launched the Lonely Planet Australia guide translated into French, and the Australian embassy put on an event for us at their very nice embassy right beside the Eiffel Tower, looking out over the Seine. And the Australian ambassador introduced me speaking in wonderful fluent French, and I had just enough French that I could sort of get up and make a little speech. And I said about how the French explorer La Perouse arrived in Sydney just a week after the first fleet of convicts had arrived there. And I said, look, if he'd only just arrived a week earlier, Australia could have ended up being a French colony instead of a British one, and I wouldn't be standing up here apologizing for my bad French. And afterwards, one of the French journalists came over to me, and she said, that was really interesting this evening. She said, so often at these events, the Anglo-Saxon person stands up and apologizes for their bad French and therefore makes their speech in English. He said, if you're a journalist in Europe today, you have to be able to speak English, and we would have all understood perfectly. She said, but tonight was different. She said, you apologized for your bad French, and then you went on to prove it.
There's one over here.
Once in my travels, I've had the luck to meet one of the Lonely Planet authors, and we've had a quick discussion about tourism, if it's sustainable. And we both realized that the more attention there is about a place, the more likely the local people are to preserve it. But he also told me that if he finds a very special place, sometimes he doesn't want to write about it. What do you feel about it?
I'll go back to the French, that, French travel writers are the worst at this because they always have their favorite bar that they wouldn't mention to anybody because they don't want any foreigners coming into it. But I always feel with travel writers, it's your job and it's your passion. And if you find something really special and you feel, well, I've discovered something that nobody else knows about, whether it's a new restaurant or some strange archaeological site that you've just stumbled upon, well, obviously you want to reveal that to the world. It's one up over the other competing guidebook writer. So no, we don't keep secrets. But on the other hand, we did learn fairly early on that you've got to be careful with your praise. That if you're writing about Hong Kong and you say, oh, there's this great restaurant, this restaurant is fantastic, so what? There's a half dozen other guidebooks, newspapers, magazines, restaurant critics, all sorts of other competing sources of information who are also recommending this restaurant and recommending that one and saying about this. But there are some places in the world where, Vietnam is a good example, that we have a really disproportionate influence in Vietnam, that just about everybody who goes to Vietnam seems to carry our Vietnam guidebook around. And as a result, if you just go over the top recommending a particular restaurant, you can just send everybody there, and all the other places around it, which might be nearly as good or just as good, get ignored. So we've always told our writers that you've got to be aware in places where your influence is going to be totally out of whack, to be careful not to lay on that praise too much. And the other thing very often we do in smaller places is recycle things. If we were only recommending 4 or 5 restaurants in a small town, well, the next edition, 2 of them get pulled out and 2 new ones get put in. So it isn't the same 5 all the time. So yeah, it is a danger, but it's a danger that we're aware of.
Okay, back here. Second microphone.
Please speak into the mic. Hi, I'm Tony. Not a technical question. Can I just ask, when you're on your personal travel, do you travel around as if you're a Lonely Planet person? Do you let people know you're the Lonely Planet person, and does that change your travel experience?
Or
do
that
you
same
try not
question.
to do that?
That same question could also be applied to the writers actually working on the books. And in some places you really have to, but a lot of places it's better and easier if you don't say you're a Lonely Planet researcher or writer. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is that if you just go in as John Smith or Jane Doe or whatever, somebody sort of anonymous, you find out what things are really like. You're not getting the special treatment. You're not getting shown to the best room in the house. You're not getting the meal very carefully prepared. You're just getting the same treatment that anybody else would. So you do get a more authentic picture if you don't reveal who you are. And the other thing, of course, is that you don't get as, if you're covering a lot of restaurants and hotels, obviously you can't eat in every restaurant. You try to, if you're in a town for a few days, you'll eat as many different restaurants as you can and try as many different places. But you do depend upon other people, giving you their opinions and so on. But if every hotel you went into, you got a 2-hour tour of the hotel, you wouldn't be able to cover many hotels. I wrote our first Lonely Planet San Francisco guide, and I spent 23 nights in San Francisco working on that book, and I stayed in 23 different hotels. Every morning I got up and I moved hotel, and the next morning I moved hotel again, and that was from backpacker places all the way up to the 5-star places. So yeah, you do try and cover as much as you can, but you very often don't reveal who you are or what you're doing.
We've got time for 1 or 2 more. Anyway, okay, on the veranda here.
Thank you. My name is Diana Williams. I'm an inveterate traveller, and I have more Lonely Planet books in my house than any other type of book. Last year I had occasion to travel on a shoestring through Cuba, and I would just like you to know how venerated Lonely Planet is there.
Oh, well, good. I'm glad.
Yes, lovely little B&Bs, and people's faces just lit up when they heard that I'd got their names from the Lonely Planet.
Good. Thank you very much. You know, it's funny. It's one of our Cuba guides. We had I forget who it was on the front, but he looked like a bit of one of Fidel's fellow revolutionaries. You know, he had the beard and the cap and everything else. And a number of people have sent us photographs of him holding up the cover of the book beside it. He was just delighted by it. And we've had a few situations of that where people who've appeared in the book in some way or on the cover or whatever, and somebody's turned up with the book, and they're really proud to hold the book up and show that they're in it. You know, the funny thing about I've only been to Cuba once, and I ended up being a little bit ambivalent about it. I really, you know, in some ways it's just terrific. The color and the music and the joie de vivre a lot of time. But on the other hand, you know, it's a lot of the problems in Cuba, Mr. Fidel has created them all himself. And, you know, okay, the Americans, their crazy embargo and everything else hasn't helped things. But I think if you wanted to say who's made the Cubans as impoverished in many ways as they are, more of the blame goes on Fidel than on the Americans.
Okay, I think we'll have to wind it up here, but if you buy the book, I'm sure Tony will sign it and give you a personal conversation. So I'd like to thank Tony in the customary way of the FCC, and give him something every traveller hates, something more for the suitcase.